In every small American town, there are days that seem to pass without leaving a mark, ordinary mornings that blend into one another, forgotten by nightfall. But sometimes, hidden within the quiet rhythm of daily life, there is one morning that will change everything. For the town of Ridgewood, Pennsylvania, that morning was Friday, March 16, 2012. The Walker household sat on a modest suburban street lined with maple trees just beginning to bud for spring. Inside, life moved according to routine. Hannah Walker, a 15-year-old high school sophomore, had her own rhythm every school day. She would wake up at 6 a.m., shuffle into the kitchen with messy hair, and pour herself a bowl of cereal before getting ready for school. Her mother, Monica, was usually in the kitchen at the same time, balancing her own preparation for work with quick check-ins on Hannah. That morning was no different, at least not in the beginning. Hannah had been adjusting to life in Ridgewood for less than a year. She had once lived in a busier city with more friends and familiar places, but the move to Ridgewood had been necessary after Monica remarried and sought a quieter life for the family. For Hannah, that meant starting fresh at a new school, Ridgewood High, where faces were unfamiliar and cliques already formed long before she arrived. Yet Hannah had a resilience that many noticed quickly. Petite, with bright hazel eyes and a quick laugh, she had the kind of personality that seemed to soften the edges of teenage awkwardness. Within months, she had joined the cheerleading squad, made a handful of close friends, and started carving out her own place in the hallways of Ridgewood High. To her mother, Hannah appeared to be adjusting fine, chatting on her phone, making after-school plans, laughing in the kitchen late at night. But beneath the surface, the adjustment wasn't always smooth. Hannah sometimes missed her old friends, the neighborhoods she knew, the streets she could walk without feeling like an outsider. Texts to her closest friend back in her old town revealed moments of frustration, complaints about having to start over, and sometimes hints of sadness. Still, nothing suggested that she would ever disappear without a trace. On that Friday morning, Hannah followed her usual routine. She dressed in her favorite light blue hoodie, a pair of dark jeans and white sneakers. Before leaving her room, she slipped on a colorful friendship bracelet she had worn for months, a gift from a friend she hadn't seen since the move. She slung her school bag over her shoulder and glanced at her phone. At 7:05 a.m., she posted a picture on social media. 10 minutes later, she sent a text to one of her friends at Ridgewood High. "Meet you before class. I'll bring the makeup and homework." For Monica, it seemed like just another day. Her daughter was leaving the house around 7:15 to walk to the bus stop at the end of their street, while Monica herself needed to get to work. Monica's fiancé, who lived with them, had already left earlier that morning. Nothing seemed out of place. The bus stop itself was unremarkable, a small patch of gravel near the corner where the school bus would briefly stop to pick up Hannah. In fact, she was the only student who boarded at that particular stop. It wasn't marked by a sign, only known to the driver and to Hannah. Most mornings, it meant she would stand alone for several minutes, waiting in the still chilly air of early spring. That morning she walked out the door, turned down the street and headed toward the corner. According to every trace investigators later pieced together, she never made it onto the bus. By mid-afternoon, the routine that had started so normally began to unravel. Monica finished her workday and drove home, expecting to see Hannah's sneakers by the door, her school bag in the hallway, maybe music playing from her bedroom upstairs. Instead, she opened the door to silence. The house was still, unsettlingly still. At first, Monica thought Hannah might be out with friends. But as she looked around the house, unease began to grow. Hannah was a creature of habit. If she wasn't going to be home, she would almost always text her mother to let her know. By 4 p.m., with no word from Hannah, Monica started calling. The school secretary confirmed the unthinkable. Hannah hadn't been in class at all that day. She hadn't checked in, hadn't attended a single lesson. None of her teachers had seen her. Her friends reported that she never showed up to their planned meeting that morning. Monica's hands shook as she made call after call, each one leading to the same chilling realization. Hannah had vanished between the front door of her home and the bus stop at the end of the street. For many parents, the first instinct in these moments is denial. Maybe their child skipped school, maybe she lost track of time, maybe she was simply with someone and forgot to call. But Monica knew her daughter. Hannah wasn't reckless like that. She wasn't the type to wander off without telling anyone. By 5 p.m., panic had taken hold. She dialed the number for the Ridgewood County Sheriff's Office and reported her daughter missing. To Monica's relief, the deputies who responded didn't brush it off as a case of teenage rebellion. Too many details didn't add up. The missed bus, the absence from school, the silence on her phone. That evening, deputies began their preliminary checks. They asked for a description of what Hannah had been wearing, details about her phone, her usual route to the bus stop. They searched the neighborhood, spoke to nearby residents, and canvassed the area around the corner where the bus was supposed to pick her up. But as night fell over Ridgewood, no sign of Hannah emerged. The next morning the search intensified. K9 units were brought in to track Hannah's scent. Dogs followed her trail down the street, past familiar mailboxes and driveways toward the corner. But halfway there the scent stopped cold, as if Hannah had vanished into thin air. Investigators exchanged uneasy looks. A sudden break in the trail usually meant only one thing: she had been picked up either willingly or by force. For Monica the hours turned into a nightmare. She sat by the phone, staring at the front door, praying it would open and Hannah would walk back in. But deep down she knew something had gone terribly wrong. The town of Ridgewood would never forget that day, the day a girl who left for school like she always did never returned. And as the sun set on that first night without Hannah, investigators realized they were no longer dealing with just a missing person case. They were looking at the beginnings of something far darker. When investigators take on a missing person case, the first step is always the same. They need to know who the victim is beyond the name and age. Every detail, habits, relationships, patterns, can provide a clue to what might have happened. And with Hannah Walker, the picture that emerged was of a girl who had everything to live for, which made her sudden disappearance even more troubling. Hannah was the kind of teenager who still hovered between childhood and young adulthood. At 15 she loved painting her nails with her friends and watching teen dramas on Netflix, but she also still kept stuffed animals on her bed, a reminder of the little girl she had been not too long ago. Her teachers described her as bright and hard-working, though not overly competitive. Her friends, both from her old town and her new school, spoke about her ability to make people laugh in the most ordinary moments. At Ridgewood High, Hannah had found a small but tight circle of friends. She wasn't the most popular girl in school, but she didn't need to be. She had people who cared about her, people she could confide in. On the cheerleading squad, she wasn't the loudest or most daring, but she was reliable. Dependable was the word many used, someone you could count on to show up, whether for practice, a group project, or just hanging out. This reliability was what made her absence so suspicious. On the morning she vanished, Hannah had texted her classmate Sarah Jennings to meet before school. They were going to trade makeup and swap notes for history class. Sarah later told investigators that Hannah's text was ordinary, routine. There was nothing in her tone or choice of words that suggested distress. That made what came next so chilling. Hannah never arrived. Sarah waited in the hallway for 15 minutes, growing impatient, then headed to class assuming Hannah was running late. When the news spread that Hannah hadn't been seen all day, Sarah's heart sank. She replayed that text over and over, searching for hidden meaning. But there was none. It was just a normal plan between two friends. The sheriff's office moved quickly to track Hannah's digital footprint. They discovered that at 7:05 a.m., she had posted a selfie to her social media page. It showed her in her hoodie, smiling faintly. 10 minutes later came the text to Sarah. After that, her phone went silent. Calls went unanswered, messages undelivered. The first break came within 24 hours. A search team combing the area near the bus route found Hannah's cell phone lying in the grass of a field less than half a mile from her house. It was face down, the screen cracked as if it had been tossed from a moving vehicle. For investigators, this was both a relief and a warning. Relief because it was proof Hannah hadn't simply run away. People who leave voluntarily don't usually discard their phones in fields. But also a warning because it suggested someone else had her. The phone was sent for forensic analysis. While experts worked, searchers pressed on. Just 2 days later, a volunteer group uncovered something far more disturbing. Inside a disused shed less than 2 miles from the Walker home, they found a purse, schoolbooks, and a set of clothes that Monica identified as belonging to Hannah. The items were filthy, covered in dirt, and some smelled faintly of ammonia. Monica's knees nearly gave out when detectives showed her photos of the recovered clothing. In her heart, she already knew. Her daughter hadn't simply wandered off. Something terrible had happened. Deputies handled the items with care, sealing them as evidence and rushing them to the lab. It was there that they discovered what could be the most critical clue of all: foreign DNA. Mixed with traces of Hannah's, there were samples that belonged to someone else, someone not part of her family. For the first time, the case had moved beyond speculation. There was physical evidence pointing to another individual's involvement. As investigators dug deeper, they began retracing Hannah's steps that morning. The bus driver confirmed she hadn't been at her stop. Other students who rode the bus remembered clearly. Hannah was usually there every day, standing alone with her backpack. That morning she wasn't. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air during the short walk from her house to the corner. But disappearances don't happen in thin air. They happen because someone makes them happen. By Sunday evening, the community of Ridgewood was gripped by fear. Parents held their children closer, warning them not to walk alone. Volunteers gathered at the local community center, forming search parties to scour fields, creeks, and wooded trails. Flyers with Hannah's picture, her bright smile underlined by the words "missing," appeared on telephone poles and shop windows. Monica, exhausted and running on little sleep, pleaded for help during a press conference. Standing in front of cameras, her voice cracked. "Please, if anyone knows where my daughter is, say something. She's only 15. She's supposed to be at home, not out there alone." Behind the scenes, investigators began piecing together a profile. The abrupt cutoff in Hannah's scent trail suggested she had been forced into a vehicle. The discarded phone implied an abductor trying to sever communication. The hidden clothes pointed to someone who had taken steps to conceal evidence but hadn't managed to destroy it completely. When the DNA results came back, the investigation took a decisive turn. The samples collected from Hannah's clothing matched a profile already in the national database. The name attached sent a chill through the department. Derek Alvarez, a 21-year-old man living just 7 miles away. Detectives immediately began surveillance. They studied Derek's movements, his vehicle, his background. It wasn't long before they discovered another critical piece of evidence. Derek owned a red 1998 Volkswagen Jetta, the same type of car seen circling Hannah's neighborhood that very morning. Piece by piece the puzzle was forming. A girl who had everything to live for had vanished, and now investigators had their first real suspect. But suspicion is not proof, and in the justice system, suspicion alone is never enough. For Monica, each day without Hannah was agony. For the detectives, each clue carried the weight of urgency. The community waited, prayed, and hoped. Everyone knew the same truth. In cases like this, every passing hour could mean the difference between life and death. The story of Hannah Walker was no longer just a missing person case. It was becoming a fight against time to prove what had happened, and to bring the person responsible into the light. 4 days after Hannah's disappearance, the community of Ridgewood lived in a state of suspended reality. Posters with her face were stapled to telephone poles. Families that once felt secure in their quiet routines now locked their doors at all hours. Strangers whispered Hannah's name in grocery store aisles, in church pews, in the hallways of Ridgewood High. Everyone wanted answers, but all they had were fragments. A phone discarded in a field, a bag of belongings hidden in a shed, and a gnawing sense that time was running out. The Walker family clung to hope in the midst of this chaos. Monica barely slept, her phone always within reach, jumping every time it buzzed. Robert, Hannah's father, drove miles around the county on his own, scanning ditches, culverts, and wooded trails, convinced that maybe, just maybe, he'd spot something the police had missed. Their lives had become a blur of interviews, press conferences, and late-night calls with detectives. Then came the first real turning point. The forensics team returned results from the clothing found in the shed. Stains on the fabric, hair caught in the seams, it all told a story. Under the microscope, DNA profiles emerged. One belonged to Hannah. The others did not. When investigators uploaded the samples to CODIS, the national DNA database, a hit came back almost immediately. Derek Alvarez, age 21, of the neighboring town of Millbrook. Alvarez wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. His name had surfaced years earlier in connection with attempted abductions near a supermarket parking lot. 3 women, different ages, had reported a man trying to force them into his car late at night. None of the attacks had escalated to full kidnapping, and at the time, evidence had been too weak to secure a conviction. But the name stuck. Now it had resurfaced, linked to Hannah's clothing. Detectives began surveillance on Alvarez. They watched him leave his small apartment, drive to gas stations, loiter near a fishing supply store. His car immediately drew their attention, a faded red 1998 Volkswagen Jetta. It was old, dented on one side, and matched descriptions from several Ridgewood residents who had seen a similar car circling the area on the morning Hannah vanished. Undercover officers tailed Alvarez for 24 hours straight, documenting every move. At one point, he drove past the very road where Hannah would have walked to her bus stop. The sight of that red car rolling casually past the spot where Hannah disappeared chilled the investigators. With a warrant in hand, police moved quickly to seize Alvarez's vehicle. The search was meticulous. Every inch was combed for fibers, fingerprints, and traces of DNA. In the trunk, under a pile of tools and fishing gear, they found what would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence: a length of rope. At first glance, it was ordinary, frayed nylon, the kind anyone might use for camping or tying down cargo. But under forensic testing, the rope revealed microscopic traces of Hannah's DNA. For detectives, this was the break they had been waiting for. Hannah's DNA in Alvarez's trunk wasn't coincidence. It wasn't explainable by chance encounters. It placed her inside his car, tied, quite literally, to the rope they believed had been used to restrain her. Still, Alvarez denied everything. When brought in for questioning, he sat across the table from detectives, arms crossed, voice flat. He claimed he had never met Hannah, had never seen her, didn't even know who she was until her face appeared on the news. His story shifted under pressure. At one point, he insisted he had been on a fishing trip that morning. But records showed inconsistencies. There were gaps in his timeline long enough for him to have abducted Hannah, concealed evidence, and returned to his day as if nothing had happened. Detectives pressed harder. How did Hannah's DNA end up on the rope in his trunk? Alvarez hesitated, then gave an answer so bizarre it left investigators stunned. He suggested that the DNA had been transferred accidentally, that one morning while driving alone he had been taking care of himself in the car, discarded a tissue out the window, and somehow that tissue had ended up on Hannah's clothing. It was a story so crude, so improbable, that it only deepened suspicion. But if there was one thing detectives knew, it was that juries don't convict on suspicion alone. They needed more. As they dug deeper, a troubling pattern emerged. Alvarez had a history not just of attempted abductions but also of aggression toward women in his personal life. Former acquaintances described him as volatile, quick to anger, and sometimes violent. He had been seen lurking around parking lots, following women to their cars, behavior that now seemed like practice runs for something far worse. Prosecutors began building a narrative. Hannah hadn't been targeted at random. Alvarez had a habit of prowling, of circling neighborhoods in his car, looking for opportunities. That Friday morning, Hannah walking alone to an unmarked bus stop was exactly the opportunity he needed. Yet for all the evidence stacking against him, one critical piece remained missing: Hannah herself. Without a body, prosecutors would face an uphill battle. Defense attorneys could argue that she had run away, that she was alive somewhere, that every shred of evidence was circumstantial. Meanwhile, Monica and Robert lived through each new development like tremors of an earthquake. Relief when they heard a suspect had been identified. Despair when reminded that Hannah was still missing. Monica attended every press briefing, her face pale, her voice trembling as she begged Alvarez to reveal what he had done. Robert, more private, poured his grief into action, coordinating search groups and refusing to accept that hope was gone. The media seized on every twist. Headlines painted Alvarez as a predator, Hannah as a bright young victim, Ridgewood as a town under siege by fear. Cameras lingered on Monica's tears, on volunteers combing through fields, on the red Jetta being towed to an evidence lot. Inside the sheriff's office, detectives felt the pressure. Every call from the lab, every tip from a resident, every late-night lead was weighed with urgency. They knew the case against Alvarez was building, but it had to be airtight. The rope in the trunk was a turning point, but it wasn't the end. More evidence was out there. They just had to find it. And as investigators pressed on, one question grew louder in everyone's mind. If Alvarez had taken Hannah, what had he done with her? The breakthrough evidence pointed the way, but the truth of Hannah's fate was still buried in silence. The evidence against Derek Alvarez was stacking up, but investigators knew that building a case wasn't just about finding incriminating items. It was about weaving together a story that a jury could believe beyond a reasonable doubt. And so, in the weeks following the discovery of the rope, detectives and prosecutors worked relentlessly to connect every thread. The timeline became their anchor. On the morning of March 16th, Hannah left her house at 7:15 a.m. to walk to the bus stop. By 7:30 she was supposed to board the bus. But she never did. Instead, somewhere between her front door and that corner, she vanished. Surveillance cameras from businesses along nearby roads were combed through frame by frame. And then there it was, a grainy image of a red Volkswagen Jetta circling Hannah's neighborhood around 7:20 that morning. A second clip, taken from a convenience store half a mile away, captured the same car heading out of Ridgewood just minutes later. The timestamp lined up perfectly with the gap in Hannah's trail. Witnesses also remembered the car. Neighbors had reported seeing a faded red sedan idling on their street in the days leading up to Hannah's disappearance. At the time it didn't seem alarming, just an unfamiliar car. But in hindsight, it was a chilling clue that someone had been scouting the area. With the DNA match, the rope, and the car, prosecutors believed they had enough to bring charges. Alvarez was arrested and charged with kidnapping and the presumed murder of Hannah Walker. When news of his arrest broke, Ridgewood was split between relief and disbelief. Relief that a suspect had been caught, but disbelief that someone so young, just 21, could be capable of such cruelty. Alvarez had lived only a few miles away. He had shopped in the same stores, walked the same streets. To many he was just another face in the crowd. During questioning, Alvarez maintained his innocence. He sat across from detectives in the interview room, expression blank, voice monotone. "I don't know her," he repeated again and again. He claimed he was out fishing that morning, though when pressed, his alibi fell apart. There were no receipts, no witnesses, no proof of this supposed trip. The rope, he insisted, had nothing to do with Hannah. His bizarre explanation, that his DNA had somehow transferred by accident, only made investigators more certain of his guilt. But they also knew how defense attorneys worked. In court, every weakness in the chain of evidence would be exploited. That prediction soon proved correct. When Alvarez's defense team stepped in, their strategy became clear. They would argue not only that there was no body, but that Hannah herself might have chosen to leave. They pointed to the fact that she had once expressed unhappiness about moving to Ridgewood. They argued she might have run away to reconnect with old friends or escape teenage pressures. It was a theory that infuriated Hannah's family. Monica and Robert knew their daughter. She hadn't packed belongings, hadn't left a note, hadn't said a word to any of her friends about leaving. Her purse, schoolbooks, and clothes were all found abandoned. Why would a runaway discard the very things she needed? And why would her DNA be found in Alvarez's trunk? The defense pressed harder, suggesting the investigation itself was flawed. They highlighted how one of the sheriff's deputies had stored the rope overnight in his garage before officially booking it into evidence. A violation of protocol that raised questions about contamination. They pointed to discrepancies in the handling of Hannah's clothing, even noting that one hair sample collected from her clothes was later missing from the evidence envelope. It was a dangerous tactic. By sowing doubt about the integrity of the investigation, the defense hoped to dismantle the prosecution's strongest points. But prosecutors had more than just DNA and rope. They had Alvarez's history. 3 years earlier, Alvarez had been linked to 3 attempted kidnappings in the parking lot of a Greenmart supermarket. Victims described a young Hispanic man with short dark hair trying to force them into a car. One woman had fought him off with pepper spray. Another had escaped by running back inside the store. Though Alvarez was never convicted, his name had been noted in police records. Now, prosecutors brought those incidents back into the light. They painted Alvarez as a predator with a pattern, stalking women, waiting for them to be alone, and then striking. Hannah, walking by herself to an unmarked bus stop, fit the exact scenario he had targeted before. In court, this history was powerful. Even if jurors struggled with the lack of a body, the pattern of behavior made Alvarez's involvement far more believable. Meanwhile, Hannah's family endured the cruel tactics of the defense. Lawyers implied that Hannah experimented with drugs, that she might have been involved with dangerous people, that her disappearance was tied to choices she made. These claims devastated Monica and Robert. To them, it was character assassination of their daughter, who could no longer defend herself. But the prosecution countered with facts. Hannah had plans the morning she vanished, plans to meet a friend before school. She had money in her purse that was never touched. Nothing suggested she had intended to run away. And the most undeniable fact remained. Her DNA was in Alvarez's car on a rope found in his trunk. Public opinion began to turn firmly against Alvarez. News outlets replayed footage of the red Jetta being hauled away, images of Alvarez in handcuffs, and interviews with tearful classmates who described Hannah's smile and kindness. For the people of Ridgewood, there was little doubt left. Still, within the walls of the courtroom, doubt was the defense's weapon. Without Hannah's body, without an eyewitness, the prosecution had to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. It was strong evidence, yes, but it wasn't absolute. Prosecutors pushed for the harshest penalty possible, arguing that Alvarez's crime deserved nothing less than life in prison without parole. They emphasized the risk he posed to other young women, the likelihood that he would strike again if given the chance. For Monica and Robert, each day of testimony was agony. They sat in the front row, listening to strangers debate the fate of their daughter, watching Alvarez remain stone-faced, never showing a flicker of remorse. The case against Derek Alvarez was strong, but fragile in its own way. One misstep, one seed of doubt planted too deeply could undo it all. The prosecution knew it. The defense knew it. And the jury would soon have to decide whose story they believed. When the trial of Derek Alvarez finally began, The courthouse in Ridgewood became a stage on which the fate of both a family and a community would be decided. For Monica and Robert Walker, it was the day they had both long dreaded and long awaited, a chance for justice, but also a public unraveling of every painful detail of their daughter's disappearance. From the very first day, the courtroom carried a heavy silence. Reporters lined the back rows, scribbling notes. Locals filled the benches, eager to hear every word. At the defense table sat Alvarez, his posture stiff, eyes darting only occasionally toward the jury. He wore a plain shirt provided by his attorney, but no matter the attempt at normality, the sight of him in that chair radiated unease. The prosecution opened with a simple, devastating statement. Hannah Walker left her house that morning alive. She never made it to school. The last place her DNA was found was inside the car of the man sitting before you today. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The early days of testimony focused on Hannah herself. Friends and teachers described her as reliable, cheerful, and full of promise. One by one, they painted a portrait of a girl with no reason to vanish willingly. Sarah Jennings, the friend Hannah had texted that morning, fought back tears as she recounted waiting in the school hallway, expecting Hannah to show up. "She never would have just skipped," Sarah told the court. "She told me she was on her way." That reliability, prosecutors argued, was proof enough that something had gone terribly wrong. Then came the evidence. Investigators walked the jury through photographs of the field where Hannah's phone was found, the shed where her belongings had been hidden, and finally the red Volkswagen Jetta, its trunk opened for the cameras to capture. When the rope was presented, sealed in a clear evidence bag, several jurors visibly flinched. The prosecutor's voice was steady as he explained, "On this rope, we found traces of Hannah Walker's DNA. This rope was recovered from the trunk of Derek Alvarez's car." The defense countered quickly. They didn't dispute that the DNA was there, but they challenged how it got there. They pointed to gaps in the chain of custody, emphasizing that at one point, the rope had been stored improperly. They suggested contamination, mistakes, even tampering. Their tone was sharp, confident, designed to inject doubt into the minds of the jury. Next, they attacked the prosecution's narrative. Without a body, they argued, the entire case was speculation. "How can you say with certainty that Hannah is dead?" one defense attorney demanded. "There is no crime scene. There is no witness. For all we know, Hannah chose to leave." The insinuation struck like a knife. Monica buried her face in her hands. Robert's jaw clenched tight. The suggestion that their daughter had simply walked away was not only implausible but cruel. The defense doubled down, calling a former teacher from Hannah's old school who testified that Hannah had once returned for a brief visit weeks before her disappearance. They implied this showed her desire to go back to her old life. Another witness suggested Hannah had experimented with pills. The defense painted a picture of a troubled teen, restless and unhappy, possibly involved with dangerous people. For the Walkers, sitting in that courtroom as their daughter's character was dissected, it was unbearable. But prosecutors were ready. They reminded the jury that Hannah's purse still had money in it, that her books were found abandoned, that she had made concrete plans with a friend the morning she vanished. No runaway does that. And none discard their phones in fields only to vanish without a trace. The turning point of the trial came with the testimony of 3 women from years earlier, the victims of Alvarez's attempted kidnappings at the Green Mart parking lot. Though visibly nervous, each described how a young man with a red car had tried to force them inside against their will. One remembered the look in his eyes, another the cold metal of a stun gun pressed toward her. When prosecutors revealed that Alvarez's fingerprints had been found on the battery of one such stun gun, the courtroom grew tense. Suddenly, Alvarez's denial seemed paper-thin. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity, they argued. It was a pattern. A predator escalating over time, finally succeeding with Hannah. The defense tried to poke holes in these accounts, pointing out that none of the women had been able to pick Alvarez out of a lineup at the time. They argued that fingerprints on a battery were circumstantial, that Alvarez had worked stocking shelves at Green Mart and could have handled batteries without knowing it. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the pattern. Day after day, the trial unfolded like a grim puzzle. Every piece added more weight against Alvarez, and every attempt to explain it away seemed weaker than the last. Then came Alvarez's own choice. His attorneys, aware of his volatile explanations during interrogation, advised him not to testify. He remained silent throughout the trial, sitting motionless as others spoke about him. To some jurors, his silence felt like cold indifference. To others, perhaps, it was the absence of any convincing defense. For Monica and Robert, the trial was agony. They had to sit and listen as their daughter's life was picked apart, her choices scrutinized, her character questioned. Yet they also saw justice forming in slow increments, built from DNA, from rope fibers, from surveillance tapes, from voices of women who had narrowly escaped the same fate. As the prosecution delivered their closing arguments, the story they told was clear. Alvarez had prowled Hannah's neighborhood, waiting for the moment she was alone. He had taken her, silenced her, discarded her belongings, and hidden the truth. The DNA, the rope, the car, the history, all of it pointed to him. The defense, in their closing, pleaded with the jury to remember the absence of a body, the gaps in evidence handling, the possibility, however slim, that Hannah had left on her own. They didn't need to prove innocence, only to plant doubt. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the courtroom exhaled collectively. Hours stretched into a day, then two. Monica prayed quietly in the hallway. Robert paced, unable to sit still. Reporters swarmed every update, speculating endlessly. Finally the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. The Walkers held their breath as the foreman stood. The silence in the courtroom was electric, every eye fixed forward. The words, when they came, fell like stones into still water. We, the jury, find the defendant, Derek Alvarez, guilty of the murder of Hannah Walker. Monica sobbed, collapsing into Robert's arms. Reporters rushed to capture the moment. Alvarez sat motionless, jaw tight, eyes forward, offering no reaction. The turning point had come. Justice, at least in the courtroom, had been delivered. Yet for the Walkers, a deeper truth remained unresolved. Hannah's body had never been found. And without her, closure was still beyond reach. When the jury returned its verdict of guilty, the Walker family finally had something they had waited for since that March morning. Recognition that someone was responsible for what had happened to Hannah. But a guilty verdict was not the end. The sentencing phase still loomed, and with it the defense's last attempts to salvage Derek Alvarez's future. In the days leading up to sentencing, the courtroom shifted in tone. No longer were jurors present. Their work was done. Now it was in the hands of the judge to decide Alvarez's punishment. Prosecutors argued for the harshest possible sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Alvarez, they reminded the court, had not only taken Hannah but had attempted to abduct women before. He was, in their words, a predator who will never stop unless permanently removed from society. The defense, faced with overwhelming evidence and a damning verdict, tried a different approach. They painted Alvarez as a product of circumstance, not pure evil. His attorney argued that Alvarez had grown up in a volatile home, with an alcoholic father who abused his children. There was mention of pesticide exposure in his youth, claims that chemicals had damaged his brain and altered his behavior. They even brought Alvarez's mother to the stand, who tearfully described her son as a loving boy who lost his way, insisting he wasn't the monster portrayed in court. To the Walkers, it was almost unbearable. Sitting just a few feet away, they listened as the man who stole their daughter's life was framed as a victim of his environment. Monica's grief hardened into anger. Robert's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white, as the defense spoke of Alvarez as though his past excused his actions. When it was their turn, the prosecution countered with clarity. Yes, Alvarez had grown up in a broken home. Yes, life had not been kind. But thousands of children suffer through difficult circumstances and never abduct, harm, or kill. Choices mattered, and Alvarez had chosen again and again to target women, to escalate his violence, until he finally succeeded. The moment that struck deepest came when Monica addressed the court directly. Standing behind the podium, her voice trembling but steady, she looked at Alvarez. "You took my daughter from me," she said, her words breaking through the quiet courtroom. "You can sit there in silence, you can deny what you did, but you and I both know Hannah didn't walk away that morning. She didn't choose to disappear. You did this. And if you have even the smallest piece of humanity left in you, you'll tell us where she is. Let us bring her home." Her plea hung in the air. Alvarez stared forward, expression blank, unmoved. He offered no words, no acknowledgement. His silence cut deeper than any denial. The judge deliberated, weighing the arguments, the history, the devastation inflicted on a family and a community. On sentencing day, the courtroom once again filled to capacity. Reporters angled for the best view, cameras outside rolled live coverage, and the Walkers sat clutching each other's hands. When the sentence was read, the weight of it rippled through the room. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Hannah Walker, plus an additional 13 years and 8 months for the attempted kidnappings of the 3 women years earlier. Monica wept openly. Robert closed his eyes and exhaled, the first sign of release after months of unrelenting pressure. Around them, supporters hugged, whispered prayers and shed tears of relief. Justice had been served, at least in the eyes of the law. But justice is not the same as closure. In the weeks following the sentencing, the Walkers returned to a house that still felt unbearably empty. Hannah's bedroom remained untouched, her posters still on the wall, her books still stacked neatly on her desk. Monica couldn't bring herself to change a thing. She would sometimes sit on Hannah's bed, holding one of her sweaters, inhaling the faint scent of her daughter that still lingered. Robert buried himself in action. He organized renewed search efforts, combing fields, rivers and wooded areas around Ridgewood, determined to bring Hannah home. To him, the trial had proven Alvarez's guilt, but it hadn't answered the most agonizing question. Where was Hannah? Every appeal to Alvarez went unanswered. In prison he maintained the same blank refusal, insisting he knew nothing, claiming innocence even as he served a life sentence. For the Walkers, it was a cruelty beyond the crime itself, denying them even the chance to lay their daughter to rest. The community, too, struggled with the aftermath. Ridgewood was no longer the quiet, trusting town it had once been. Parents walked their children to bus stops, car doors were locked religiously, and strangers were eyed with suspicion. The shadow of Hannah's disappearance lingered. At vigils held in her honor, candles flickered in the night as classmates and neighbors gathered to remember her. They spoke of her laughter, her kindness, the way she could brighten a room. But always in the back of everyone's mind was the haunting absence. Hannah's body had never been found. For Monica, the sentencing brought both relief and torment. Relief that Alvarez would never harm another girl, torment that her daughter's story was incomplete. In interviews she spoke with quiet determination, "We're not done. We'll search until we bring her home. Until we can say goodbye properly." Robert echoed the same, often with sharper words. "He has daughters of his own," he told reporters. "I can't understand how a father could take someone else's child and then sit in prison refusing to say what he did. That silence, let it eat away at him." And so, life after the trial became a balance of grief and perseverance. The Walkers grieved what they had lost, but they also persevered in their search for the truth. Organizations dedicated to missing persons reached out, offering support. Volunteers continued to comb the countryside, chasing every lead, every whisper, every rumor. Years might pass, but for the Walkers, time froze on March 16, 2012. Their daughter's story was written in headlines and court transcripts, but also in the unending ache of absence. Justice had been delivered, but closure remained out of reach. And for the community of Ridgewood, Hannah Walker's case became a reminder that even the most ordinary mornings can shatter into tragedy, and that sometimes the hardest part of justice is not the verdict, but the silence that follows. The sentencing of Derek Alvarez marked the legal end of the case, but for the Walker family the story did not end in the courtroom. Justice had been pronounced, but justice did not bring Hannah home. The absence of her body left an open wound, a silence that no verdict could fill. In the months following Alvarez's conviction, life in Ridgewood slowly tried to resume. The town that had once been defined by trust and routine carried scars now. Parents who once let their children walk to the bus stop alone began accompanying them every morning. Porch lights that once went dark at bedtime now stayed on through the night. Conversations at grocery stores or gas stations always seemed to circle back to the same name, Hannah. The Walker home became a quiet shrine to their daughter. Hannah's room remained untouched. Her bed, neatly made, still carried the colorful pillows she had arranged months earlier. Her notebooks lay on the desk, the last page filled with half-finished doodles. Monica often sat there at night, staring at the handwriting, running her fingers along the paper as if touch could summon her daughter back. Robert handled grief differently. For him, pain demanded action. He became relentless in organizing search efforts, contacting private investigators, and working with nonprofits dedicated to missing persons. On weekends, volunteers would gather with maps and flashlights, combing wooded trails, riverbanks, and abandoned lots. Each search ended in disappointment, but Robert refused to stop. "One day," he told reporters, "we'll bring her home. One day we'll lay her to rest the way she deserves." The media, which had once descended in full force, slowly shifted away, leaving the family in quieter isolation. But anniversaries always brought the cameras back. On March 16 each year, vigils were held. Candles flickered in the night as classmates, neighbors, and strangers gathered to remember Hannah. Her photo, framed in light, stood at the center of these gatherings, a reminder of a girl whose smile could light up a room, a girl who had been stolen too soon. For the Walkers, Alvarez's silence was the cruelest torment. Even after conviction, he never admitted guilt. He never revealed what he had done with Hannah's body. He clung to his claims of innocence, as if denying the obvious could erase the evidence against him. To Monica, this silence felt like a second crime. "He knows," she said in an interview. "He knows what happened. He knows where she is. And he chooses to let us suffer every day." The case began to resonate beyond Ridgewood. Advocacy groups pointed to Hannah's disappearance as a lesson in the importance of immediate response. Too often, missing teens are dismissed as runaways. But in Hannah's case, law enforcement had taken the report seriously from the start, and that speed may have been what secured crucial evidence before it was lost. Schools began to adjust policies as well. Ridgewood High implemented safety protocols for students who walked alone. Bus stops that were once unmarked gained signage and, in some cases, surveillance cameras. The unspoken rule of small towns, that nothing bad could happen here, was gone. Yet Hannah's legacy wasn't just about fear. It was also about resilience. Her family, despite their grief, became advocates for other families of missing children. Monica began speaking at events, sharing her story, urging communities not to wait until tragedy struck before taking action. Robert helped launch a local chapter of a national missing persons foundation, channeling his pain into purpose. And the community responded. Vigils turned into fundraisers, awareness campaigns spread across counties, and Hannah's face, once seen only on missing posters, became a symbol for a larger fight against silence and neglect in missing persons cases. For those closest to her, though, the lesson was more intimate. Friends spoke of Hannah's laughter, her kindness, her ability to make people feel seen. Teachers recalled her reliability, her steady presence. To them, her story was a reminder to value the ordinary moments. The text messages, the shared jokes, the quick smiles in hallways. None of them had known that their last conversation with Hannah would, in fact, be their last. In the end, the case of Hannah Walker left behind a dual legacy. On one side, it was a story of tragedy, a young life cut short, a family left to grieve without closure. On the other, it was a story of determination, a mother and father who refused to let silence win, a community that turned pain into vigilance, and a justice system that, despite imperfections, held a predator accountable. And yet, the haunting truth remained. Hannah's body had never been found. Each night, Monica prayed not only for her daughter's peace but for the strength to keep searching. Each morning, Robert rose with the same vow. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever would they stop looking. For the rest of Ridgewood, Hannah's disappearance became more than a local crime. It became a reminder that safety is fragile, that evil can wear an ordinary face, and that justice, even when served, does not always bring closure. The candles at her vigils still burn, their light fragile but unyielding, much like the love of a family that will never let go. And perhaps that is Hannah's true legacy, not just the tragedy of her vanishing, but the enduring lesson she left behind, that every life matters, every absence leaves an echo, and every silence demands to be broken.